All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into, it's a pretty sensitive topic, anti-Indian sentiment in the U.S., and particularly how it's playing out around the H-1B visa program.
Yeah.
You've said over some really interesting sources, a mix of news articles, some economic analysis, even some historical accounts. And I think our mission here is to really try to help people listening understand all these different facets of this debate without, taking sides.
It's such a complex issue, and I think what's so often missing is any historical context.
Right. And to really get why this current debate is so intense, you got to understand it's not just about economics or policy. There's this long history of anti-Indian sentiment in the U.S. that goes back way further than, all these recent headlines about Elon Musk and Donald Trump.
Yeah, we're talking decades, like even going back to the late 1980s with groups like the Dot Busters who specifically targeted Indians, often Hindus, with violence and hate crimes.
Wow.
It's a very dark chapter.
Yeah, that's a shocking detail. It really makes you realize how these deep-seated biases can stick around and affect how people see things even today.
Absolutely, and that historical context is key if we're going to have a meaningful discussion about this H-1B visa debate. So the H-1B program basically allows U.S. companies to hire foreign workers for specialized roles, mainly in fields like tech, engineering, and science, areas where you need very specific skills. And a big chunk of these H-1B holders are Indian professionals. The program was really designed to help U.S. companies fill the gaps, when they just can't find enough qualified American workers to meet their needs. The whole idea is to keep the U.S. competitive globally. Well, one of the biggest fears you hear is that H-1B workers are taking jobs away from American citizens, especially in those really high-paying tech roles. There's this concern that companies are using the program to hire cheaper foreign labor, and that just undercuts American wages. And, you can see how that feeds into those anxieties about economic insecurity, especially for folks who are already having a hard time in the job market. The U.S. needs something like 400,000 engineers every year, but only about 70,000 graduate from American universities annually.
Wow.
That's a huge difference. Without access to global talent, a lot of companies simply wouldn't be able to fill these critical positions, potentially slowing down progress and even impacting job growth for everyone. Well, Musk's proposal is to set a higher minimum wage for H-1B workers, basically equal to or above what American workers in similar roles are making. His thinking is that this would prevent companies from, exploiting a wage gap and undercutting American workers.
So he's trying to address those concerns about unfair competition, but still allowing companies to get the talent they need. What was his stance on H-1B visas during his presidency?
Well, Trump's approach was very much aligned with his America First policy. His aim was to really prioritize American workers and to reform the H-1B program, to give U.S. citizens priority when it came to tech jobs.
And how did that actually translate into policy changes?
Well, his administration implemented several changes, like increased scrutiny of H-1B applications and stricter requirements for companies who wanted to hire foreign workers.
What are the experiences of Indian immigrants who are actually living this, navigating this really complex and often contentious landscape?
Well, it's a mixed bag, to be honest. And so even if you have a great job, even if you're contributing to the economy, even if you're building a life here in the U.S., there's always this fear that your visa might not get renewed, and then you'll be forced to leave.
That must be so stressful, constantly worrying about your visa status, not knowing what the future holds. It's heartbreaking to think about, and that's all before you even factor in, the rising anti-Indian sentiment that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. A lot of Indian immigrants are saying they just feel increasingly unwelcome or even threatened in the current climate. It really is, and it underscores the importance of remembering the humanity of everyone involved in this debate. These aren't just statistics or economic units, they're real people with hopes and dreams and anxieties just like anyone else.
You're absolutely right.
Well, when it comes to the H-1B program specifically, there are a number of potential reforms that could be considered. Streamlining that whole application process would be a good place to start, make it less cumbersome and bureaucratic. Another important step would be to provide clearer pathways to permanent residency for these skilled workers so they're not constantly living in fear of being forced to leave. And of course, there needs to be strong oversight to prevent worker exploitation and make sure American workers are being treated fairly. It's all about finding that balance that we keep coming back to, protecting the interests of American workers while also creating a system that welcomes and values global talent. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time really unpacking this whole H-1B visa program, exploring the economic arguments and even going back into the history of anti-Indian sentiment in the US. But I think now what we want to do is really bring this home for you, the listener, and look at what's at stake here, not just for the US economy, but for the actual people whose lives are really shaped by these policies.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to remember that, behind all these statistics and, all these policy debates are real human stories. Yeah, one data scientist we talked to, Raj, he told us how exhausting it was to constantly feel the need to prove his worth, to justify his presence in the US. It's like they're being forced to defend their right to be here, even when they're excelling in their fields and contributing to society.
Yeah, Raj, the data scientist we talked about earlier, he actually said that despite all these challenges, he still really believes in the American dream. He said he's so grateful for the opportunities he's been given, and he just wishes that more Americans would see him and other immigrants as individuals, not just as representatives of some, political debate. Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is the importance of nuance. This isn't a black and white issue, There are valid concerns on all sides. There's this need to protect American workers. But we also want to attract global talent and create a system that is fair and just for everybody.
Right, exactly. We've seen how, these historical biases can still affect how we see things today. We've seen how economic anxiety can fuel resentment.